Basically, I've had hip pain for the last 10 years, and there really hasn't been a day that's gone by that I haven't felt pain in my left hip.
My wife Sally and I, we're just kind of looking for ways to be faithful to Norman Community and really serve. And because I'm prophetically gifted and she is a pastor, but then she's prophetically gifted, we thought, well, man, the perfect place for us to really be able to serve the church is before just pre-celebration prayer. And so that's something that we've just tried to build in over the last year to our marriage, of going an hour before the service starts and just praying and just serving in that regard. And
prayed for a lot of people over the years, and I do receive occasional short words for people, small prophetic, mostly encouraging things like God saying, "You're my beloved son," or "It's a time of new beginnings," or just sweet, short little things. Not necessarily for a healing in any great measure, although I've prayed for many sick people, but I don't know how many have actually been healed.
Kind of as we were praying, probably about halfway through the meeting, basically I felt this kind of like sting, real quick sting in my hip. And my first thought after that was, oh, we need to pray for people with hips, which is probably the second time ever that has ever happened to me, where most of the time I get a pain and I'm like, oh man, I ate something funny, or man, I'm getting old because I'm sore. But in this case, it was one of those where I felt kind of this quick pain in my hip, and my first thought was, man, we need to pray for people with hips. But it was so different than I guess how the Lord normally speaks to me that I kind of sat on it for the rest of the meeting, and I was like, man, it's kind of weird, and I don't know, and so I kind of tried to re-engage in prayer, but it was kind of the only thing that I could think of. I couldn't get rid of it, and basically prayer ended, and I'm still sitting there, and I was like, okay, I'd rather share it than not share it. And so I kind of was like, hey, before you guys leave, I felt this thing in my hip, and it feels like the Lord might want to, touch some people physically who have, hip and leg problems. They're like, okay, well, let's just, we'll just see what happens. We'll go through worship, and they just asked me if I'd be willing to kind of go up front and pray for people at the end, and I was like, sure, no problem. And
I didn't feel like necessarily that it was me. I felt unusually optimistic and just hopeful that it was me. And I just felt excited that God could possibly heal that. And I definitely had feelings of, this isn't that big of a deal, but to me it really mattered. And so I was just excited that God could possibly do that for me.
Hannah and I know each other pretty well. She is a good friend of mine, and she asked me to pray for her hip, and I remember just bowing my head and laying my hands lightly on her shoulders. And since I know her well, it was not awkward for me to touch her. Then I just reached around and laid my hand on her hip.
I just walked up to Kim and I just briefly described what the problem was with my hip, and she just started praying specifically for that. And I just remember her laying hands on my collarbones and my left hip, and pretty much right away I felt just a warm sensation through both of my collarbones, and then in my left hip it was a slight burning sensation. It wasn't so painful that I was gonna fall to my knees, but I definitely could feel that specifically on that side of my body.
Just kind of pressed a little bit, but I didn't feel anything. I just felt a sense of peace in God's presence, but I didn't feel anything else. I didn't know that anything happened, and I was completely surprised to find out 3 weeks later that she had been healed.
I walked back to my seat, and I wasn't in pain when I went up there to be prayed for, so it was more of something where I just waited. Usually I felt the pain in the evening time after I'd been on my feet all day, so that night I kind of noticed that I didn't have any pain, and then I didn't say anything even to Derek for about a week, because I thought, well, maybe it's just a fluke or something, which that's probably not faith, but I was just nervous that it would come back, and then after a week it didn't, so I shared that with Derek, and now it's been 2.5 months and I haven't had any pain.
I actually do remember what I prayed a little bit. I remember I had just recently been listening to some audio CDs on the word sozo, and that means salvation, and salvation doesn't mean just salvation of the soul. In the Greek, it means salvation, saved, healed, and delivered. And I said exactly that. I said, Lord, we just thank you that your salvation on the cross, it wasn't just for our souls, but also for physical healing and to be delivered.
Nothing is too small. I mean, I know that sometimes I feel like, I shouldn't ask God for that, but just because there's so many big issues that he could be dealing with, but it was an act of love on his part towards me, and because it mattered to me, it mattered to him.